Welcome to the last in the series. If you tuned in for Seinfeld or Friends, whenever it was, when 28 million people gathered around their TVs to watch the last episode, well, today is the last episode in a masterclass series with Fortuna that we've been running for the last 9 weeks. And we have worked our way from coast to coast, from one top school to another. And of course, my wonderful fortune to work with so many extraordinary coaches that bring with them all of this insider admissions experience from the world's top business schools. So this masterclass series, as today, we will be focusing on Berkeley Haas. We'll be looking at life in New Haven at Yale's School of Management, and then where the sun always shines at UCLA Anderson. These masterclasses, of course, you might be catching this live with us, and I know as a very engaged audience, we look forward to your questions, but perhaps you're picking this up on Fortuna's YouTube channel. However, we're glad that you're with us and that you enjoy the next 60 minutes of insights. But this is just part of perhaps your story and where business school and an MBA might fit in with the next steps of your personal and professional development. And of course, all of the great advice that we share with my colleagues at Fortuna is really just a first step for connecting and finding out where business school fits in those plans. So do find us on the Fortuna website. You can sign up for a free consultation to really look at your background. We take a lot of time to read your resume, understand where business school might fit, and we hope have a very engaged and a very helpful discussion about possible next steps. So as I said, this is one in a series, and of course with each of them, given that Fortuna brings together so many talented individuals and their admissions experience, it's lovely for me to host Sharon Joyce. Sharon was a former Associate Director of Admissions at Berkeley Haas. Also with us, Jessica Chung, former Associate Director of Admissions at UCLA Anderson and USC Marshall, and Zachary White, the former MBA Assistant Dean of Admissions at Johnson Cornell, and also with the Yale School of Management. So no, I feel that we've got your title wrong there, Zach. That must be on me. I should have checked that slide. Zach is very much about Yale, of course, one of the schools. Should we be talking about an M7 when there are so many great schools beyond that initial list? Well, I think that Haas, Yale, and Anderson would all make a great case to be on that list. And of course, if you're joining us, it's because you can very much see why these fantastic schools will fit in. So we hope as we look at the cultures and each of the different aspects that the schools are then looking at in the assessment of your application, that this will be as useful as all of the other sessions that we've recorded. We started with Harvard, Wharton, Stanford. At some point, we sneaked in some international schools with INSEAD and LBS and kept going. And here we are for this last one in the series. So we're putting the bar very high for our panelists. You know, we've got to end on this wonderfully high note, but I know these people and I think they're going to be absolutely extraordinary. So we're going to start with Berkeley Haas, those 4 pillars and the culture of an extraordinary school. Sharon, you've spent many years there, love Berkeley Haas. What makes it such a special place for you and perhaps more broadly?
I think you already, you didn't steal my thunder, but I did want to talk about the defining principles because I think that that really lays the foundation for everything that Berkeley Haas is all about. There was a lot of thought put into the defining principles, and so much so that even parts of the application will echo back into that. For example, the whole confidence without attitude. Berkeley Haas is unique in the sense that in the letters of recommendation, your letter writers are asked to talk about a time where you showed humility and modesty within the workplace. And so I think that that's something that makes Berkeley really unique. In terms of talking about the 4 defining principles, there's question the status quo. So really thinking about shaping leaders who are going to be bold in their decisions and innovative in their work beyond Haas. As I just mentioned, the confidence without attitude. And I have to really share in a very authentic way, when I worked at Haas, I was constantly amazed by this crop of really smart, bright, talented students, but who were so humble about their accomplishments and so willing to always help, really invested in bringing other great students into the program. And so I do think that confidence without attitude was one that I felt like I would encounter almost every day in my interactions with students. And then students always is the third defining principle. And that really gets to this sentiment and this sense of intellectual curiosity that they're always trying to encourage in the student population. Welcoming a diversity of perspectives. Things are not taught just from a very Eurocentric viewpoint. And so really encouraging students to think about diverse perspectives. And saying that too, I'm on a lot of listservs for Berkeley still. And within the last 2 weeks, I've received 4 different emails talking about some initiatives around diversity and inclusivity at the school. And so I think that Berkeley Haas is really going to make a mark in terms of making sure that they're at the forefront of being sure that different voices are heard. And then the final defining principle is beyond yourself. And so this is really important in terms of thinking about corporate social responsibility. In fact, there's a whole center at Haas that's engaged with corporate and social responsibility. There's a Center for Responsible Business, and all of this is making sure that they are creating leaders that really have solid ethics, they have a strong moral compass. And so I think those are the things that make Berkeley Haas special in terms of the culture. I would say with the curriculum too, it's kind of a hybrid. So there are core classes, there are 14 core classes that students will take, but the second year is really comprised of taking different elective courses that are tailored to your passions and your interests. And keep in mind too, Haas is one of the smaller MBA programs with an enrollment a little bit over 300 students. And so students get to know each other very well. You know, they're not just classmates, but a lot of people will be future colleagues as well. And so I think within that culture of the defining principles, there's just so many good offshoots from that in terms of just thinking about the curriculum itself. It has a whole emphasis on leadership development through courses like leadership communication. It has a whole global emphasis, not just because you're going to be in classes with students who are from all around the world. I think their statistic is they have about 40 countries represented every year, but also opportunities to do things like studying abroad. If you have an interest, you can spend a semester at LBS or HSA. I don't know if this is really foreign, but you can also spend a semester at Columbia University in New York City.
It's a whole different world.
Exactly, right? And then there's also a whole focus on experiential learning with really cool opportunities like the IBD project, International Business Development, where students will spend time in the spring semester engaged in an international problem that they're solving for a company or an organization. And then they spend a few weeks in the summertime too, solving that problem as a team. And again, giving people experience and giving them exposure to things outside of just sort of this American ideal of business. And so I think that's really important as well. You know, two other things that I don't want to hog all the time, but I'm very passionate about Berkeley, is just the breadth and depth of the co-curriculars. So lots of professional clubs, but things that range from things that you would expect, like the consulting club, finance club, to things exploring new industries like the cannabis club in California. And then finally, just thinking about the proximity to so many things in the Bay Area, not just leveraging all that you can within the city of Berkeley, but beyond that into the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as obviously the proximity to Silicon Valley, which is the hub of technology. And a lot of students are able to take advantage of those different areas, particularly Silicon Valley, for networking events like the Menlo Circus that they have every year that brings in a lot of people in technology for students to network with, forge career opportunities, things like that. And so there's just so many things that are special about Berkeley Haas. And I would really welcome people to definitely take a look at the school's website. They have lots of opportunities for coffee chats with admissions and things like that, so that you can hopefully get Berkeley on your admissions list as well.
Of course, you've been challenging the status quo for all the years that I've known you, Sharon. The times have changed, because I think if 10 years ago you talked about wanting to become the president of the Cannabis Club,
Right?
I'm not sure how that would have gone down in admissions. But you know, with such a sort of a collaborative, connected culture, we often talk at Fortuna about some of the research you can do in reaching out to alums, perhaps individuals that share those interests and passions, and they're so wide and diverse, as you said. Those can be great discussions for anyone trying to find out more about the school. And I think Haas students and alums are so proud that they tend to be very, very responsive, I think.
Absolutely. I would agree 100%.
Mm. Well, of course, Haas is part of UC Berkeley, and I guess you know, there's a parallel at Anderson within the wider UCLA that brings this entire dimension of a business school that fits with everything else that's going on that university campus. Jessica, how would you sort of describe and define the culture at Anderson?
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely are tons of parallels between UCLA. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. I wasn't quite, okay. Yeah, definitely tons of parallels between UCLA, Anderson and Haas. See, oftentimes applicants apply to both schools because there are a lot of similarities. You know, being in whether it's location, diversity, the composition of the class, and just the community as well. I would define Anderson, and this has always stuck to me because, you know, from the time that I've worked there to just the continued connections that I have with the school, and, you know, just working with candidates who are applying, is this, there's a community, it's a community that's fiercely supportive. I mean, I call it this fiercely supportive, very like super edifying community collective of individuals, and it kind of spans the entire school. So there's, you know, whether it's students or the administration, the faculty, the alumni, you know, there's just so much support and so much kind of dedication to helping one another out. It's definitely a place of team over self, and there's just so many examples of this that happened over the years, and even just with everything going on with the pandemic and all the pivots and changes that have, you know, that have had to take place, from in-person to remote learning to hybrid, and just, you know, all these changes going on. As you know, as with students, what I've always seen is, of course, you know, the stories of students always, you know, kind of looking to help others with recruiting, with academics. You know, if you're recruiting for the same types of roles, you know, they're not gonna hog up all of the resources or the insider information, so they have a competitive advantage. All of that information and insight is going to be shared with their classmates. Even if you're vying for the same jobs, and there might only be hiring, you know, a handful or one or two, you know, they're not going to keep that information to themselves just to be able to have that additional benefit of having, you know, so I think that's, you know, one aspect. Same thing with academics. If anyone is going through a difficult time, you know, the students will all rally and help one another to succeed in the classroom, you know, sharing notes, doing study sessions, test reviews, etc. You know, anything, group projects, all that stuff. It's very team-based, very collaborative. And again, there's just really no individual autonomous work that goes on, you know, across business schools. I think that's the case, but it's really something special at Anderson. On a personal level, this is a part that I think really resonates with me and with so many applicants and those who decide to, you know, choose Anderson as, you know, when it's time to make that decision of which school to attend. It's really this community that, like I mentioned, just rallies around one another. During the pandemic, you know, I heard about, you know, ways that the students really made an effort to connect with one another virtually. You know, a huge part of business school is all about connection and building relationships and doing all these projects and activities together face to face. So having to pivot and do these things virtually and still forge these authentic, genuine connections was really hard. You know, but the students really came through. They created, you know, spreadsheets and Google Docs and shared docs, and, you know, to really just to like list different activities, you know, video chats, Zoom conversations, cooking classes, just like anything that they can do to just stay connected with one another, you know, on a more personal level. Because more than business school, I mean, it's such an intense environment that if you don't have the support of those around you to help you to, when you're challenged, when you're frustrated, when you're stressed or anxious, it's really, you're not going to make the most of that time. And so I think the students and I think the admissions team really makes a concerted effort to make sure that the students, that the class that they're crafting every year is going to have that special dynamic and connection. During those times when there were, when I guess like with the Me Too movement, I remember when that was first happening and building STEAM, the building allies for women. That was a really powerful movement that happened that started with the Women's Business Connection, and it just spread throughout the entire Anderson community at all levels. And I thought that was incredible. It's just another way of showing support. We're here for you, not just academically, not just professionally and successfully, but as a human. I see you, I see your needs, and I'm always gonna be here and show up and help you in whatever way I need. And when think of business school, it's not really something maybe that's foremost on top of your mind when you're applying, but I think this is something that's really special and important to consider, is that if you're going to thrive in an environment like this, to really look for schools are going to have that type of a culture and community. Right. And then I guess like even with the administration, Rob Weiler, who is the senior associate dean of the MBA program, he makes a very concerted effort to hear students out. He has meetings with them, one-on-ones, takes them to lunches. He really wants to keep a pulse. And I think this is true of the administration as a whole, to show that we, in the background are here to support you as well. If there's a need, if there's something that needs to be changed, it's uncomfortable for the school because it's going to, improvement and change, it's going to take time, and it's marshaling resources, and it's having to try new things, but they truly do care and want to hear students' thoughts and opinions and take that into consideration just to make the program even better and stronger in the future. And then for alumni, I always find this to be the most endearing thing about our alumni network, is that they never leave the school. And I think it's just great. It's just this continual support, again, of the community, even from the moment you step on campus, and I swear it's for the rest of your life. So I see so many alums who come back to the school in various different shapes and forms, whether it is working, as part of the administration or teaching, as a career advisor, in admissions. I have alumni who come back, or I've seen alumni who I still keep in touch with, come back and do like leadership talks, do communications classes, do diversity, DEIJ initiatives. And so there's just a lot that, and they're not necessarily working for the school. It's that they come back and they want to give their time back because they love Anderson. They love what the school did for them, professionally and personally. It was truly a transformative experience, and they just want to stay connected and give back. And that's the way that they show their support. And they do this truly a lot of times out of just, because they want to, not because it's anything that they're like being compensated for or whatnot. And they know that when they were students, they leaned heavily on the alumni network for so much professional development, for networking and everything. So this is a way that they can continue to pay that forward. So I really find that just lovely and endearing. And overall, this fiercely supportive community is going to be with you for the rest of your life. So it's great. You're not going to leave that environment and that ethos once you graduate and you move on with your life and your career, and you're not together 24/7 during business school, but you're going to still have this alumni network, your classmates as well as others in the community that are going to stay with you. And part of what the admissions team also looks for is, will you also continue for that culture of paying back and coming back and giving back in the same way that you received. So overall, I think it's a really special place, and I still have so many fond memories and so many great connections to the school.
Yeah, no, you've painted a very heartfelt picture of this, the very tight-knit community, incredibly supportive. And it is wonderful to place emphasis on this because, as you say, not only during the 2-year experience, but how you will carry that with you for the rest of your life. Perhaps in the second part of today's session, as we're looking at the different elements of the application, how you can actually convey to the admissions office that sense of loyalty, ambassador roles that you've played, different activities that you've engaged, and to give Anderson's admissions committee a sense of that sort of commitment. So a fantastic place to start. And now we'll head, I guess, to the East Coast, where, of course, it's a balmy 70 degrees for 360 days of the year, right, Zach? I mean, the School of Management at Yale, I guess, is youthful. It's what, mid 70s, but has had tremendous impact in the last 45, 46 years to the point that it's reached now. You were very happy with the time that you spent, Zach. So we talk about a good fit at these schools. What does that mean to you when we apply it to Yale School of Management?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'd like to actually just pause and maybe unpack this idea of fit a little bit, because we throw it around so often when we're talking about this, but it's not one-dimensional in any sense. You know, this is an academic, going to business school is an academic experience, but it's also kind of a professional exercise. And of course, there's kind of the social and cultural elements or dimensions of you know, how you spend your 2 years, and then there's context. You know, think of living for 2 years in Berkeley or Pittsburgh or Raleigh-Durham or Manhattan or Hanover, New Hampshire. You know, so I would encourage, you know, anybody who's kind of exploring schools and thinking about it to really take some time to understand their own priorities, right? So fit is complicated, but it's also very personal. And you have to know the schools, but you kind of have to know yourself before you can really understand what a good fit is. And everybody's going to have different kind of preferences and priorities, and it's multivariate. So when I think about SOM, if we were just to kind of use some of these boxes, you know, professionally, it's often seen as a school that's a good fit for folks who are interested in nonprofits or public service. And there are some good, interesting historical reasons for that. And it's true to some extent, the school does attract a higher percentage of folks who are kind of coming from the nonprofit sector or the public sector, or who want to pivot into that kind of work. But the differences aren't as big as you might think. The school is still sending 75% of its graduates into 3 industries, you know, tech, finance, and consulting. And those track pretty well with kind of what you're seeing at peer institutions. So while it may shade kind of towards public nonprofit, and I think is reflected in the school's ethos and its curriculum and its culture and its values in some ways that I'll talk about in a second. It's a good school for folks who kind of want to go into one of the big 3 industries. So, and I saw a question pop up in the chat, you know, what is Haas known for? And we use these kind of heuristics to say, oh, you know, it's a marketing school, or it's a finance school, or it's a consulting school. But in some ways, that's moot. Most of these top programs have the resources to support and challenge smart, hardworking, ambitious communicators, you know, from all sorts of backgrounds who want to come and do lots of different things. So, you know, when you zoom out, you know, fit is important, and this is a big investment, and you need to think about it carefully. But, you know, Yale's a place that can support lots of different kinds of students, just as Anderson or Haas or Kellogg or, you know, Gazetta. So that's kind of how I would frame SOM professionally. It's a pretty kind of mainstream place in a lot of ways. Academically, I think the school really rewards balanced, flexible, curious learners. They have an integrated curriculum, which is very interdisciplinary, and that kind of encourages people to think about things in complex ways and causes and effects across silos. And then they have these raw case studies, which are very practical, and they kind of anchor all the theory in real world experience. You know, it's project based, it's ambiguous, they're fuzzy. It's as much about asking the right questions and kind of running the right diagnostics as it is about, you know, finding the right answers or solutions to those problems. And then you know, culturally, it sounds very similar to Anderson and Haas in a lot of ways. It's a smaller school. It's in a smaller city. They care a lot about community and a lot about diversity. At the same time, it is a very international place, and the kind of, not the current dean, but the most recent dean, Dean Snyder, who came from Chicago Booth, you know, was very intentional about, you know, building the school's international profile, and it is one of the few schools in the U.S. that's part of the Global Network for Advanced Management. So the school welcomes big thinkers, and that gets back to the public-private piece, and wanting to kind of tackle big issues in the world, and that requires public-private cooperation. You know, kind of look no further than the current pandemic to understand how industry and government need to work together to really solve issues. And then, you know, that includes climate change and global finance and inequality and wealth disparities. So Yale's interested in people who are thinking big, but are also kind of considering the impact of their work on the public good. So there's a kind of moral compass that the school is eager to kind of develop in all of its graduates. So they might sound like unicorns, but I think SOM is interested in, you know, down-to-earth dreamers, people who can really balance thinking and doing.
And I suppose, you know, for all three of the business schools, the relationship that they have with the parent university and you know, three world-class institutions globally recognized, and that will play into to the experience, Zach, presumably at Yale. I don't know, can you audit classes from some of the other departments and colleges on the campus?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the school, and kind of going back to its founding, was very well integrated with the other kind of professional and academic graduate programs at the university. So, you know, of course, Yale's law school is very well known, and there are a handful of dual degree students who are admitted every year. But for example, the School of Forestry and Environmental Science is really a global leader in kind of sustainability, and has been for generations. And there are kind of close ties between that school and SOM, but also, you know, School of Architecture and Medicine. So yeah, a great resource and a global brand, and I'm sure alumni from Haas and Anderson, as you mentioned, Matt, you know, kind of draw on all of those networks as well.
Right, and each of you, as you've described the institutions, you very much put, you know, the individual and maybe that sense of self to find the right business school, you know, having that sort of self-awareness, whether it's in terms of the relationship to the community or being forever a student, or, you know, Zach, what you were talking about of sort of solving some of the world's big problems. So perhaps now if we take a dive into the components of the application and that sense of self as we look at it across the lens of professional, academic, extracurriculars that you do. Sharon, if I can start with you, just from the professional experience, maybe, I mean, it's almost like a trick question. What is the right background? There is no one right background among those 285 students at Haas, but how do you interpret that in terms of what the admissions office at Haas is looking for?
Overall, and I think most business schools follow this, that minimally they want to see people who have about 2 to 3 years of work experience, though on average it's more like 5 years of work experience. There isn't one specific job title or job family that we would be targeting. I think it's more of looking at what you did within that time within your workplace, any sort of professional milestones that you've had, the progression of your career. If you've switched organizations, was there a logical reason for that? Embedded within the application, there are some pretty deep questions that ask you to talk about your work experience, but also your reasons for leaving. And so having a way to really articulate that your career trajectory to date makes a lot of sense and was logical, but that you're now missing something, that you've had that self-awareness to realize that to get from point A to point B, there are some things that you still need to get under your belt in terms of maybe some more experience in finance, or if you're someone who's been in engineering and you want to move into a career in consulting, having some ways to talk about those skills that you did acquire in your work experience to date, but how you really need to hone those a bit more, perfect them. And the best way to do that is through the MBA education. With the exposure to the curriculum and new classes that you would have under your belt, to also then taking advantage of some of those clubs and co-curricular activities like conferences that again will help move your career towards that point B that you're looking for. I know that some schools, I believe, read by industry. We read by country, but again, within industry, showing that track record, showing that logical progression, showing that you had some key milestones in your career, and then also having letters of recommendation who will back up what you've had to say about your career. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more in depth about letters of recommendation in a few moments. But again, having 2 to 3 people who are able to really articulate that you are poised for leadership and why an MBA is the next right step for you in your career.
Right. So if we look at the detective work that you and your colleagues at Haas used to do, starting with the resume, and as you're going through bullet points, perhaps changing job titles, you talk about that logical progression. Perhaps sometimes it wouldn't appear logical, and that might be something that someone wants to address, just to get a sense, I suppose, of a path that you've chosen and choices that you've made.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And all schools in some form or fashion have that sort of that other essay. So is there something else that you want to share with us? And so for sure, I would see candidates who might have looked like they were jumping around a lot, and they took time to really explain, though, how their career was unfolding and why these different job leaps made sense in the kind of whole picture of what they want to do in terms of the exposure that they gained, making those decisions in their career to where they want to go moving forward. And so if you have something that seems non-traditional, definitely share that with the admissions committee. And as Zach was saying, by and large, the output is a lot of people who go to work in finance, technology, and consulting. That's a lot of the people who we have applying to the programs as well. But keep in mind too, the schools are always looking for those unicorns, right? I'm currently working with a client who has this amazing experience with Teach for America. And that makes sense because they're thinking about a career in ed tech. So again, looking for those pieces of your story and putting it together. I've said, and I hate to sound trite, but all schools do a really holistic review when looking at applicants. And so we're thinking about you as a puzzle and how do all of these little pieces fit in. So again, there isn't sort of, a silver bullet in terms of professional experience that will get you in, but in terms of helping the admissions committee understand that the path that you've taken thus far is really on you. And I would say working with a coach for sure can help you as well in thinking about how to articulate your professional credentials to date.
Right. Jessica, the Fortuna team, we wrote a piece about the over 30s applying to business school, which has been read by over 250,000 people, which suggests there are many that haven't decided in their mid-20s that the MBA is the next step. Perhaps if we take those examples, we often get questions about individuals that maybe are a little older than the class average, and I think Anderson did have a student a few years ago that graduated at the age of 41. But in terms of how might that older applicant then leverage the additional experience that they're bringing? And is there anything that they really then need to reassure you of in terms of the career steps that they would want to follow as they came out of the program?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think as an old, number one, I think I never looked at an applicant as, I guess like the age wasn't really what stood out so much in when I was on the admissions team. It was more maybe the amount of experience that the candidate is coming in with. So that was really the way kind of we approached it when I was working in admissions. And what we wanted to see was if you have kind of more experience, you're coming in with greater number of years under your belt, and naturally you'd be older as a result. What has your career trajectory been like so far? So if you've been kind of meandering through life and, there hasn't really been a real, it's hard to kind of connect the dots in your career path thus far, then it would be really hard to make a compelling case as to why a business school is the right path for you now at this stage in your life. And it would be kind of, you would have to really come up with a good unifying story, to really tie those pieces together and make sense as to why this is the best next step for you. And how did everything that you learned in this process get you to a point where you're also going to be a meaningful contributor in the classroom? So I think that that's part of the challenge of applying. Maybe if you have a little more, if you're a little bit older and have more experience, is to take and tell that story in a way that's going to be persuasive and make sense with the next steps in your career. So if it seems like you're still not sure what it is that you want to do, and an MBA might help you get to that next realization, then that's not really going to compel the adcoms to want to bring you in. But on the flip side, what I think is when someone does have a very rich story, they're able to really kind of bring together all of the learnings and all of the wisdom that they've accumulated over this time. It can be an advantage because the majority of your classmates are going to have much less experience, and they probably haven't seen as much, dealt with as much maybe conflict or, just like other issues and problems and innovative solutions that you might have had experience and exposure to. And that type of perspective can be really interesting and just, really add to the fabric of discussions that come up in the classroom and in group projects and other things. So if you're able to convey and persuade the admissions committee, and you can make a good case for how you still be a great supporter and leader and part of your classmates, of your team, then I think that will help to, I guess, convince the reader of your place in the community and how you can really contribute to the ethos, of the culture.
And I guess the sort of contribution that Jessica's describing, Zach, it also picks up on what Sharon was discussing earlier in terms of recommenders and their ability then perhaps to share insights and perspectives that go beyond those bullet points. What to really give a sense of you in terms of what makes you tick or your value system. What are the sort of additional insights that a recommender could bring that would really impact you as an admissions officer at Yale?
Yeah, the recommendations are really valuable as a reader. It's corroboration, from somebody who has authority and who knows the candidate well. And the best recommenders have a good perspective on where the candidate sits vis-a-vis their peers or past applicants that they've seen kind of transition to an MBA, and so it's kind of corroboration on the personal, or I'm sorry, on the professional front, and a kind of unpacking of the skills and the achievements and the impact. But the best recommenders then take that next step and talk about the softer skills, self-efficacy, confidence, humility, as Sharon was mentioning as well. Those are really, really important to succeeding in business school and beyond. All that kind of interstitial stuff, it's very, very hard to measure in a lot of ways, but it is so important and often shines through in the best recommendations.
Right. So there's sort of a first start to professional, and again, a reminder to viewers that we've organized a number of the webinars that really just take a deep dive by subject. So whether it's letters of recommendation, GMAT and test scores, your resume. There are lots of masterclasses on the Fortuna website to check out. I guess as I move then to academics, Jessica, and the idea of undergrad performance, those test scores and the sort of data points, fixed numbers that you're looking for, or a broader holistic sense. How much time, for example, Jessica, would you spend on someone's transcript to really understand some of the class choices that they've made?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely more than just your overall GPA when we're looking at academic performance or academics. And I think sometimes applicants can get hung up on, I only have a 3.3, or, and the average at UCLA is 3.5, or average here is a 3.8, and I'm not competitive. But definitely, truly, the admissions team will kind of evaluate and ruminate on many different aspects of the transcript. So whether that's the rigor of your major, the rigor of your coursework, trends, if you maybe didn't do so well, maybe the first year or two of undergrad, but that you've been trending upward in the rigor of your classes, you've been taking challenging classes. And I liked what Zach said earlier about balanced, curious, and flexible learners. And I think that is something that we try to understand if somebody is not just taking classes because they're just taking classes because they're easy, or just because that's something that you take, but really, are you taking these classes because you're truly interested? Are you really truly interested in engineering this aspect? Or, are you truly interested in sociology, in ethnic studies, like whatever it is, right? And I guess this also goes back to the fact that there's no right major to that, or the ideal major that adcoms are looking for. So number one, I guess to go back, looking to do like the potential to do well in a rigorous environment. The classes, I mean, to be quite honest, in business school, they're rigorous and people are challenged, and it's oftentimes, more often, or maybe not too often, but there will be instances where you're going to struggle, where some people may struggle. This is where a supportive community will also be very helpful, in helping you with your academics. But at the same time, it will do nobody favors if you're struggling and then you're not going to be able to reap the benefits of all the other offerings that business school has. So that's part of it. It's looked at in tandem with your test scores, GMAT, GRE, as well as other aspects of your application. So the transcript isn't looked at in a silo, which is great, because if you maybe didn't do so well, but you have amazing test scores and you have like this really rigorous quantitative, like analytical, great work experience to kind of balance all these things, the adcoms are going to look at all of this comprehensively. And so I think to not get hung up on one particular part of the academic side of the application, whether that's test scores, that's also a huge anxiety inducer. I didn't perform at the level of the average of the GMAT score that's on the class profile. And what I always tell, my candidates is, don't just focus on the average, but look at the range, because the range, I think, is more telling. It gives much more of a comprehensive view and perspective of the class. So yeah, there will be people, of course, who are going to score very highly. And then there are going to be classmates that are going to score maybe more on the lower end. But guess what? There's probably other really compelling factors about their application that are standing out. And so I think, when we work together, I'm always like kind of this, like a positive psychology proponent. So let's look for reasons for admit. Maybe your test score is not the most compelling reason to admit, but let's look at all these other qualities that can help balance that out. So whether that's academically, whether that's, professionally, maybe there's something really, if you're worried about your quantitative score on the GMAT, let's say, but you have some great rigorous courses and you have this really analytical work experience or this analytical piece of work that you've done, let's highlight and shine a light on that. So I think that's part of it. The other part of academics is upholding the mission of the admissions team to craft a class with a very diverse perspective, approach, and problem-solving kind of mindset. So if you look at it like you're creating this very homogeneous, incoming class of everyone kind of tends to come from something business related, then you're not really being stretched by your classmates, or by your environment. You're going to kind of look at things, look at ideas or solutions maybe in the same light. I think what's great about schools and adcoms that, for the most part, are going to want to bring in people, candidates that have these various, I guess, like differences in the way their minds have been kind of taught and trained. So if you're approaching a problem or you're having a discussion in the classroom, you're going to have a different perspective from someone who was trained or, majored in public policy versus someone who majored in econ versus someone who majored in, medicine, who like a, MD, MBA candidate. They're going to look at, I think, problems. They're going to look at and bring forth approaches and ideas that are going to be kind of unique and different. So then I think that forces you also to look at these other viewpoints. And so that's one piece of it. Of course, this is all kind of balanced out by by work experience and other life experiences as well. But I think academics is also a big piece of that because, you do have 4 years or more of rigorous knowledge and learning in a very specific type of a major or a certain path. And so just not having this like monolithical way of thinking, I think really just enhances that learning environment. And that's part of like what that balance is between what adcoms are looking for, as they're evaluating your transcripts in tandem with like your test scores and all these other pieces.
Right. So Jessica's encouraged us to look at ranges rather than that average, which can be, I guess, so limiting in what it actually captures. Sharon, we have one of our viewers who went on to do a master's in climate science, the sort of diversity Jessica was also alluding to. If you had perhaps a weaker undergrad performance, is then performing very well at the graduate school level, as well as those test scores, a great way to demonstrate the sort of academic rigor that you as an admissions office are going to feel is essential to flourishing in the classroom?
I would say it's somewhat. It depends also on the other components in the application. I mean, keep in mind, in terms of having a level playing field, you will be more so compared against other undergraduate records, but certainly going back and doing a master's degree, particularly that has a lot of quantitative courses, that will certainly help your profile. It also will show to the admissions committee that you were serious, you're serious about education. You also need to, though, I think, have a good case of, so why do you want this other master's degree since you've just completed a master's degree? So again, kind of getting back to that professional experience, if your trajectory has been more on an academic path, being able to articulate and explain why you chose to do that master's degree, what is that added to your background, and then why does this now make sense for you to pursue the MBA degree as well? So again, it's kind of like connecting a bunch of different dots in that case. But I think as long as you take advantage of positioning yourself in a way that shines a light on the decisions that you've made, I think that the admissions committee would look favorably upon that secondary master's.
Great. And given the emphasis that you've all placed on very, very committed members of that business school community, there are lots of clues, I guess, Zach, as you look through a profile. Everything else beyond those M&A deals or the PowerPoint decks of slides you've put together as a consultant, and this whole personal piece, that goes arguably back to what, high school? I mean, that there's no limitation of time frame. So what it is that you're sort of looking to identify, that the passions, interests, where someone has really made a commitment or an engagement?
Absolutely. They want to know, how you contribute to your community, and kind of project that into how you might emerge as a player on their campus, as a leader or a strong supporting player in clubs or competition teams, or in lots of different ways. And how will you be engaged as an alumnus or alumna of the institution, right? Most people who are applying to business school are very, very busy, right? So time is a scarce resource and it's precious. And so how you spend your time outside of work can be a great clue for the admissions committee about what is really most important to you. And yeah, it's a chance to showcase your values, your motivation, your purpose, and it is both personal and professional, right, Matt? You framed it as kind of personal, but these extracurriculars can do some professional lifting as well on the resume. So on the personal side, highlighting character traits, right? Resiliency, teamwork, curiosity, your values, if you're interested in education or the environment or social justice, or just, kind of community writ large, right? Seeing yourself as part of something bigger, a bigger project. Those can all be nice touch points for kind of the bottom few lines of your resume. But there's also this kind of professional element, highlighting leadership, for example, outside of work can be really important. If you're in, a 2 or 3 year analyst program and you don't have a lot of personnel management experience coming into your MBA, okay, well, where have you found opportunities to kind of develop those skills and flex those muscles outside of the work? Or outside of your work environment, unique skills that you might bring, or perspectives, language skills, travel. Sharon talked about kind of Haas is a particularly international place. Yale has the same thing, right? That global perspective is really, really important to them, and that could be a place to hit this if it's not a part of your work or your professional experience. And then operationally, kind of aside from the personal and the professional angles that you can work into these co-curricular points, and they do kind of overlap, and hopefully there's some synergy. Operationally, I always encourage clients to think of them like professional bullet points, stressing quality over quantity, being very specific, dates and dollar amounts, and any way that you can kind of pin down the impact that you've had, and all that just kind of boosts the credibility of your resume, of the document. And what they're really looking for is sustained, real commitment. Right. So the more specific you are, the more credibility you have. And then the last thing, is to make it memorable. I'm really blessed to work at Fortuna and have access to the knowledge and wisdom of so many spectacular folks. And two great colleagues, Heidi Hillis and Carla Cohen, collaborated just last month on an article in Poets and Quants about this exact topic. And making it memorable always helps. When the AdCom is reading a resume and they're reading maybe by industry, and there are lots of consultants and they're plowing through them, that's the person who has more scuba hours and certifications than and they've dived all these wrecks all over the world. That's kind of cool. Not that everything has to be kind of big or flashy in that way, but I think if it's personal and it's important to you and it's something that you've invested in over the years, then trust yourself and trust that it will be memorable and authentic when the committee sees your resume.
So Zach, those more than 40 spectacular colleagues that we're both fortunate to work with, they're incredibly insightful, very sharp, got a great sense of humor. So Sharon, given the years of experience, in admissions that you have with Haas, when you would see an application, it feels that, in the 6 months perhaps before applying to business school, suddenly there's this accumulating list of, walking puppies at the animal shelter, or
right.
helping to bag at the grocery store in Minneapolis. How would you look at that? Zach talked about commitment. Were you able to sort of see through and identify what you felt was, sort of genuine engagement?
Sure. But and we laugh about it because that definitely would happen, that there's this sort of flurry of activity, again, the 6 months leading up to applying. But I would also pause a little bit and look a little bit more deeply at that applicant's background. I mean, perhaps this was someone who was a first generation college student who had to self-finance a large portion of their undergraduate studies. And so they didn't have time to do a ton of extracurricular activities, or they weren't able to be engaged in research or things like that. And so, I would look for seeing if there is that kind of link, that they know that they need to have these at schools are looking for them. And this might have been the only time that they've been able to do so. And then I would also look, though, too, at what they're saying in their essays. If there's someone who has said that, they've been so dedicated, or they want to do something that has a social impact, or something that is really at its core being of service to others, but I don't see that echoed in any other piece of their application. I would question the authenticity around that. And so, again, it is a holistic approach. And so if we do see someone with sort of that flurry of activity leading up to applications, we would go back and sometimes I feel like our job, and I'm partial to this anyway, but is being Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys in terms of, investigating people's backgrounds and really kind of trying to make sense of what's happening. And again, getting back to that, if you do fall into kind of that category that you had different circumstances through your undergraduate career, you do have an opportunity to tell the admissions committee, like, gee, I realize I'm short on extracurricular activities, but this is what was happening in my life at that time. However, please don't take that that I'm disinterested in being involved. In fact, I really look forward to joining X club and Y club should I be admitted to the program at Haas. And so again, I think just making sure that you kind of explain what's happening.
Yeah. And with an 8-year-old at home, step aside Sherlock Holmes and certainly Nancy and the Hardy Boys. It's Enola Holmes, the younger sister, who's the sharpest mind of the family. So, briefly, Jessica, when we think about, beyond the workplace and academics, do you remember ever reading applications where something that someone had done in that sort of extracurricular or, community engagement was just so powerful? Zach talked about being memorable, and it was like, oh, I have to meet this person.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm gonna have to go and think about this for a bit, but for some reason, somebody that I just cannot, I think part of being memorable is also not being afraid to showcase something that you are really interested and passionate about, even if it might seem kind of quirky or unusual. And the one person I always kind of think about when I, think of extracurriculars is an applicant who was super passionate about Legos. And on first thought, it seems a little odd because Legos you kind of associate with, my kids, right? So younger generation folks, but it's apparently, it's a huge community, and there are these very, strong Lego, like communities and competitions and building communities and such. And it's a big thing. Something I actually never knew about. He was very involved in this community and built some really incredible structures, and just really was able to show creativity and innovation and authentic interest in and kind of manifesting through this hobby / passion. And so I always found that to be really kind of heartwarming. And I thought, yeah, on kind of at first when you're looking at this, maybe you might be questioning, should I put this on my resume? Will it come across as a negative or a positive? It's a little bit risky maybe, but I think he really, we always say be authentic in the application. And he did that. And I actually really appreciate that. It was a conversation piece. I was like, tell me more about this, this Lego building community. And we had a conversation around it. I learned something from it. And I also learned more about just this other dimension to his personality, his values, his passions, his interests. And it just, it was something that I actually found to be, at the end of the day, a great add-on to his resume and to create a conversation piece around. So that's, it's, I don't know, that's the one that always kind of comes top of mind when I think of these unique extracurriculars.
You've just placed some very colorful, it's Lego after all, and very powerful bricks in our path. Lego features in almost every team building exercise in some of the best executive education courses at business schools. So I think you're really onto something with that one. I don't know where my life would be without Lego. Now, in terms of perhaps drawing all of this together, and certainly with the experience and the many hundreds, if not thousands, of applications that you've looked at, Sharon, we could either frame it as a top tip, something to really consider and apply, or flip it and say, well, here's something not to do. So what would be your sort of top share
Well,
putting
Jessica
together the
just
house
hit on it in terms of being authentic, and I think the tips we have, it's not just relevant to Haas, but I think all of us would become, I think, frustrated if we were reading essays that felt like they were being written to game admissions or to appeal to the admissions committee in a way that just doesn't ring sincere or ring true. So again, I think being really authentic in your essays. I think there was a question on the board though about, when do I kind of draw the line though? Because a lot of schools really want to learn more about you as a person and about your life story. I think though, again, working with a coach can be helpful to make sure that you're hitting the right tone, because sometimes I would read things that I felt like, I'm not sure I'm really comfortable reading this. And I would maybe question that person's judgment for maybe disclosing something that didn't seem appropriate or right for this kind of professional school application. But at the same time, there are also some really riveting things that students have shared that are appropriate, that then makes the person on the other side of the desk reading you want to learn more, want to invite you to interview. So I would say that authenticity piece is really key. And then just briefly too, letters of recommendation, Zach already mentioned how important they are. I think that sometimes candidates don't realize that it can be a real bummer. We get super jazzed reading about a candidate, and then we get to letters of recommendation that fall flat or suffer from what I call the flowery adjective syndrome, that there are some nice words that are used to describe you, but there's no kind of key details, concrete examples, things that really back up what your letter writers are saying on your behalf. And so I think it's really important to manage your letter writers in terms of equipping them, with a cheat sheet of all the great things that you accomplished while you were being supervised with them, a really up-to-date copy of your resume, and then be sure too with your letter writers that you give them a deadline that makes sense to submit letters of recommendation to. Oftentimes, the day after a deadline, we would come in and hear a lot of panicked voicemails. There's always a handful of people for whom a letter writer didn't make the deadline, but that's on you too. Again, that's sort of a judgment piece. And so, you would then just be moved into the next round. So I guess the two things I would talk about would be an authentic voice in your essays, as well as making sure that you really manage your letter writers and equip them with enough information that they can write really strong, peppered with key examples, letters of recommendation on your behalf.
Right. And I guess for a webinar, we're recording this at the end of June, and that 2.5 month window, it's you might need to give those recommenders a nudge in order to meet those deadlines, and how that will reflect on your application. Exactly. So Jessica, a tip perhaps specific to Anderson, or as Sharon said, something that is actually applicable for any great candidate.
Yeah, I mean, specific to Anderson, I think uniquely over the last couple of years, or maybe it's not uniquely, but like the trend for Anderson has been to really cut down on the word limits for their essays. And so my greatest tip is really to make every word count. You have 250 words for this year's essay on a really big topic, how the events of this, this year impacted the way that you want to make an impact in your community, your career, or both. And to be able to write something meaningful and interesting and persuasive and human in 250 words on this topic is really, really challenging. And definitely this year, or this last application cycle, it was challenging for my clients, for myself as well as a coach, to be able to convey emotion in such a brief amount of space. And so I would say just really to keep that in mind for Anderson's essays. They're very specific on what they want. Be human in your applications. I guess that can kind of go across the board for any school. It's easy to make this very just very transactional, like checklist. All right, got my GMAT GRE score done. And, here's my transcript, and I have my recommendation writers, and so I think sometimes what gets lost in the process is your unique personality, character values. You as a human, as a multi-dimensional individual, sometimes can just fall through the cracks. And so this is where I think the deep self-reflection, doing the work forefront in the beginning. Oftentimes with a coach is super helpful because you're doing this internal kind of, you're looking internally, you're looking at your motivations, and you're really having to probe and question, why am I going to business school? What is it that I really need? And yes, there's this degree end goal at the end of the day, but what is the transformation that I want, and why, and how will like Haas, Anderson, Yale, et cetera, how will these schools specifically help me to get to have that experience? And how's that going to help me both in my immediate and long-term goals? So I would say, think about that and do that work up front. It'll make the whole process, I think, so much easier, especially when it comes time to writing these very reflective, deep essays.
Right. If we take authenticity, as Sharon pointed out, or the sort of that human side, Jessica was also emphasizing. Zach, applicants want to shine, but is there room for vulnerability?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that I've said a couple times in various contexts is that you are going to school after all, and the point of an education is to grow and change and challenge yourself and improve. So, if you were perfect, what could they teach you? And schools want to. They've worked very, very hard to build these programs and these communities and these curriculums to help move the needle with applicants. And they want to leave their mark on you. So they don't necessarily want people who come in fully formed and have nothing to learn and have already maxed out all of their stats. So absolutely, there's room for vulnerability along many dimensions. You do want to put your best foot forward, and you want to present yourself with confidence and know that you can kind of keep up and do the work and that you have a plan. An MBA program is a real sprint, professionally and academically. There's not a lot of room for kind of exploration, but there's some, and that's good, and that's okay. And kind of showcasing that in your application, I think there's absolutely room for that as well.
Right. And your key tip for any applicant to Yale who's thinking, I've got that deadline, round one in the middle of September? It's
funny. I was going to present all this with a caveat that Yale has not kind of released their application yet for 2021, but they just posted it. So I'm kind of looking over here, and I can confirm the essay question is the same this year as it has been for the past few years. So we have deadlines, and it looks like most of the elements are the same. There are a few unique things. There are video essay questions at the beginning. There's also a kind of behavioral assessment, 100 questions, it's a 25-minute online test. That's a little unique. I think more and more schools are actually picking up and using some of these tools to add even more dimensions, right, to their understanding of the candidates. And it's not so biased towards, like their writing ability, because listening and of course speaking comes through in the interviews. But yeah, they're getting more sophisticated in how they understand people's talents and their potential and their preparedness to succeed along many dimensions in these programs. And Yale's kind of been at the forefront of that with their application and been pretty innovative. So we talk about kind of triangulating. It's getting harder, actually, a little bit harder to kind of game the application and project a narrow image of who you want the AdCom to see when they pick up your file. So more and more, I would lean into the advice of Sharon and Jessica, especially at Yale, be yourself, be true to your values and your vision for where you're coming from and where you're headed, and you'll be on solid ground.
Right. Well, a shout out then for Sharon as a certified Clifford Strengths coach, because of course, that whole sort of understanding of self. Just very briefly, I guess, as we close the interview stage and how to prepare. Sharon, do you want to lead with that one? I mean, suddenly the chances have gone from 14 applicants for every one place at Haas, and now maybe it's 1 in 2. So it's a big step. and perhaps will make some applicants very anxious. What would your advice be?
A couple things. I mean, I think first and foremost, if you're allowed, I guess, to know who will be interviewing you, that can really change a little bit about your preparation. So someone who's part of the professional admissions team will have had a read of the entirety of your application. And so they can ask questions about academics and things like that. Whereas if you're with a current student or with an alumni, sometimes all they have is your resume. And so there might be more of a focus on your professional experience. So I think it's important to know a little bit about who will be interviewing you. I think too, even if you think you are an excellent communicator, you must practice, but there's this fine line of practicing but not sounding rehearsed. And certainly there should be questions that you would expect in terms of, why do you want to get an MBA? Why do you want to come to our school? So making sure that you can answer those questions, but then also knowing a little bit about the programs where you'll be applying. Harvard will do a lot of rapid fire questions, and so you really need to prepare for that. Whereas the London Business School, they might ask you to do a presentation about a topic and give you 5 minutes to prepare. So again, I think it's just making sure that you know what the expectations will be walking into that interview and making time to really prep for it. Not just some of the softball questions, again, why an MBA, things like that, but things that will be specific to that program in terms of what they're looking for. I know particularly with Haas, there's always going to be some sort of question about how have you encouraged diversity within the workplace and inclusivity. And so being able to also, understand what are some of the things that are very important to that particular program. I think one thing that's great about Fortuna though too is that we have this great repository of interview questions. And so if you are working with a coach, we usually will take a lot of those questions out and really practice them and make sure that our clients feel well prepared to go in and really slay the interview.
Right. And Jessica, just to confirm, when at Anderson, I'm sure at the other schools, when you would send an invite to interview, it's because you had seen something genuinely interesting in that applicant that made you think, how will they fit into the Anderson program? It wasn't just I'm going to interview them, but we're never going to accept them. This was a very positive statement that they've really seen something in you as a candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's limited resources to interview, and that's why unfortunately, schools can't interview everybody who applies to get that those extra data points. But you do have to stand out on paper or in that initial reviews of your initial application. And I think that's encouraging for those who, might feel like, that they're again, kind of going back to maybe numbers, because it's hard data. Like, are my numbers good enough? But if there is, I think putting in that work, I think this is like Sharon and Zach were saying, working with a coach can be really helpful, is that sometimes there might be data points or aspects about yourself that you might not think is really very interesting, but from an outside perspective, and especially someone coming from, extensive admissions experience, it actually might be something that could stand out and catch a reader's eye. So I think, to really be very strategic on what it is and think about ways that you can differentiate yourself. And those little kind of tiny little data points might not be something, big and sparkling that's going to, get you all the way to let's, definitely admit this person. But little things I say might incrementally move the needle. And then if you're maybe borderline, or maybe there's, as long as you can capture the interest of the admissions committee, like you said, and they have this deep curiosity to get to know you in person, to just get a little bit more insight on whether our program is the right fit for you, then that's, huge. It's monumental in increasing your odds for admission.
Now, usually we reach the questions stage, and I've been scrambling to keep up with the Q&A, but we have such accomplished panelists today that they have been reading that feed and threading their answers as we go. So thank you for making my job so much easier. Paratosh, a great example. You've asked a question. Well, that's something that we could tackle in those free strategy sessions that we offer. So do head to the Fortuna website for a consultation, as you've had a sense in the last 70 minutes. My colleagues have extraordinary insider knowledge of business schools, the sort of insights that they can share. and that repository of how that's reflected across so many of the top schools. So we hope that you'll reach out and get your free consultation. And as I said at the beginning, this is the last in the masterclass series that we've done, covering so many of the top US and international business schools, as well as webinars that were dedicated to some of those themes around the resume, letters of recommendation, test scores. I think we've covered a lot in the last 9 weeks, but it was wonderful to be able to go out on a high note with Sharon, with Jessica and Zach, all three of you. Wonderful. I always learn so much with each of you, and you share it in such a warm and thoughtful and encouraging way, which I think for everybody that's thinking about that step of applying to business school is so precious to them. So thanks for joining us for this session. And we encourage all of the viewers to check out the many resources on Fortuna's website and our YouTube channel. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.